Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that I think is going to resonate with just about everyone: how to learn better. And lucky for us, we've got some fascinating research to guide us. We're talking about spaced practice and interleaved practice.
Two of the most powerful, evidence-backed learning strategies out there.
Exactly. And what we're going to do in this deep dive is break down not just what they are, but how they actually work in your brain.
Because understanding that, I think, is what really unlocks the ability to use them effectively. It's not just about, oh, do this, do that. It's about, okay, this is why this works, and this is how I can apply it in different situations.
I love that. It's about getting that deeper level of understanding so you can really tailor these strategies to your own learning goals.
Exactly.
So to set the stage, let's do a quick overview. Spaced practice, the basic idea there.
Right.
You learn something, you take a break. You come back to it later. It's the opposite of cramming.
Right. You're intentionally distributing your learning over time.
And then we have interleaved practice. So this one also involves spreading out your learning, but instead of taking a complete break, you're mixing different topics or skills together. Like you might work on some algebra, then switch to some geometry, then back to algebra.
As opposed to just focusing on one thing until you feel like you've mastered it and then moving on to the next.
Right. Now, the big question that kind of jumped out at me from this research: are spaced and interleaved practice essentially the same thing, just, different ways of spacing, or are they actually tapping into fundamentally different processes in our brains?
It's a really good question because on the surface, they might seem very similar, right? You're not cramming in a case.
Right, you're spreading things out.
But the research suggests that there is a really key distinction.
And that's what I'm excited to get into, because I think that's where we might have some real aha moments for people listening. And don't worry, we'll keep it nice and clear, even though we're going into the cognitive science here.
Absolutely. We're going to break it down.
Okay, so where should we start? I mean, what's the fundamental thing that sets spaced and interleaved practice apart?
Well, the research really points to this concept of rest from deliberate learning as
Mhm.
being the key differentiator.
Rest from deliberate learning. Okay, I think we need to define that. Can you unpack that for us, especially in the context of spaced practice?
Sure. So in space practice, those breaks that you're taking between your study sessions, those are periods where you're not actively trying to learn or recall the specific information that you're studying. You're essentially giving your brain a chance to kind of reset.
So like literally doing something totally different.
Exactly, like, sleeping. You study something, you go to sleep, you wake up the next day and you study it again. Or even just taking a break to do something completely unrelated, like listening to music, going for a walk, talking to someone about something else entirely.
It's a true break. It's not like, oh, let me just switch to a different subject.
Right. The key is that your working memory, that part of your brain that's actively holding and processing information, isn't engaged with the material that you're trying to learn.
Got it. It's a mental pause button, basically.
Yeah. And the idea that this allows your brain to consolidate the information that you've learned, kind of move it from that short-term active working memory into more of a long-term storage.
So it's almost like, when a computer saves a file. It takes a little bit of time.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
Okay, so that's spaced practice. Now, how does that compare to what's going on with interleaved practice?
With interleaved practice, even though you're switching between different subjects or skills, your brain is still actively in learning mode. There's no real mental disengagement from deliberate learning.
Right. You're still focused on the learning tasks.
Exactly. You're simply shifting your focus from one thing to another.
Okay, so if the nature of the rest is so different, it makes sense that these two strategies might actually be leveraging different cognitive mechanisms. Let's talk about why space practice is so effective. The research we looked at kept coming back to this idea of cognitive load theory. Can you give us a quick primer on that?
Sure. Cognitive load theory, or CLT, essentially provides a framework for understanding how we learn and, specifically, the demands that learning places on our cognitive system, on our brains.
Okay, so it's kind of like the owner's manual for our brains in terms of learning.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And one of the key principles of CLT is that our working memory, that part of our brain that actively holds and manipulates information, has a limited capacity.
We only have so much mental RAM, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does spaced practice help us within this framework of CLT? What's going on with our working memory when we space things out?
Well, when you're actively learning something, especially if it's challenging, you're using up the resources of your working memory. And if you keep going without a break, those resources can become depleted.
Like a phone battery that's constantly being used.
Exactly. And when your working memory is depleted, it becomes harder to effectively process new information, to make connections, to really understand and remember what you're trying to learn.
So it's not just about feeling mentally tired, it's actually impacting our ability to learn.
Right. It's like trying to run a marathon without stopping for water. Eventually, you're going to hit a wall.
So spaced practice with those periods of true mental rest is like allowing our mental battery to recharge.
Exactly. Those breaks give your working memory a chance to recover. And then when you return to your studies, you're starting fresh with more available resources.
I like that. It makes it so much more intuitive. The research mentioned a study by Chen and colleagues from 2018 with young students learning fraction addition. Can you tell us about what they found in terms of working memory recovery?
Yeah. So in this study, they compared students who learned fraction addition all in one go, which we call massed practice, with students who had the same amount of learning spread out over several shorter sessions, with breaks in between.
So spaced versus massed.
Right. And what they found was that the spaced practice group not only performed better on tests of fraction addition, but they also showed greater availability of working memory resources after their practice sessions compared to the mass practice group.
So not only were they learning better, they also had more mental energy left over.
Exactly. And this really suggests that those breaks in spaced practice were allowing their working memory to recover, leading to both enhanced learning and a reduced feeling of mental fatigue.
That's amazing. Now, something that came up in the research that I thought was really interesting, it seems like while cognitive overload often involves really complex topics like, advanced physics or something,
Right.
the spacing effect can actually happen even with simple things. Like, even if you're just trying to memorize pairs of words.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it highlights that even with simple tasks, sustained mental effort can still lead to a gradual depletion of working memory resources. It's not just about being overwhelmed by complexity, it's also about the cumulative effect of continuous processing.
Interesting. So it's not just about the difficulty of the task, it's also about the duration of our mental effort.
Right. Think of it like this. If you were to lift a relatively light weight over and over again without any rest, eventually your muscles would still get tired.
Right. Even though it's not super heavy.
Exactly. And it's kind of the same with our working memory. Even simple tasks, if done without breaks, can still lead to that feeling of mental fatigue and a decrease in our ability to learn effectively.
So even for those, seemingly easy tasks, taking breaks can actually be really beneficial.
Absolutely.
Now, when we talk about spacing our learning, are there different ways to do it? Like different patterns of spacing?
Yeah, there are. The research talks about uniform spacing, expanding spacing, and contracting spacing.
Okay, break those down for us.
So uniform spacing means the breaks are all the same length. So for example, you might study something for an hour every day. That would be uniform spacing. Expanding spacing involves gradually increasing the length of the breaks as you go. So you might study something today, review it tomorrow, then wait 3 days, then 5 days, and so on.
So the breaks get longer and longer.
Exactly. And then contracting spacing is the opposite. You start with longer breaks and gradually make them shorter over time.
Okay, so which of those tends to work best?
Generally, the research suggests that expanding and uniform spacing are more effective for long-term retention compared to contracting spacing.
So it's better to either keep the breaks consistent or make them gradually longer.
Right. And expanding spacing often seems to be particularly beneficial. And the thinking there is that as you become more familiar with the material, those longer intervals kind of force you to work a little bit harder to recall it.
So you're almost challenging yourself.
Exactly. You're challenging your memory just at the edge of forgetting. And that seems to really strengthen those memory traces.
Interesting. Now, the research also mentioned a bunch of other explanations for why spaced practice works. Things like the study phase hypothesis, rehearsal, consolidation, encoding variability. It seems like there's still some debate in the research community about, the exact mechanisms underlying the spacing effect.
There is. There are multiple perspectives, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. It could be that different mechanisms are at play in different situations, or even that multiple mechanisms are working together.
So it's a complex picture, but we know spacing works.
Exactly. The takeaway for anyone listening is that regardless of the precise mechanisms, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that spacing out your learning leads to better retention than cramming.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift gears and talk about interleaved practice. We mentioned earlier this idea of the discriminative contrast hypothesis. What is that, and how does it explain why interleaving is so effective?
Sure. So the discriminative contrast hypothesis basically proposes that interleaving, by forcing you to switch between different but related topics or skills, helps you to better distinguish between them.
So by constantly jumping back and forth, we're actually getting a clearer picture of the differences.
Exactly. It's kind of like if you were trying to learn to identify different types of birds, and you only ever saw robins together and then sparrows together. You might not really focus on what makes a robin specifically not a sparrow.
Right, because you're not comparing them directly.
Exactly. But if you see them mixed together, you're constantly having to make those distinctions. Okay, this one has a red breast, the other one doesn't. This one has a different beak shape.
So you're actively looking for the contrasting features.
Right. And that process of actively comparing and contrasting helps to solidify those distinctions in your mind.
That makes so much sense. And the research has a lot of examples of this, right, in different areas.
It does, yeah. A classic study from 2008 by Cornell and Bjork looked at learning to identify paintings from different artists. And they found that students who interleaved their study of those artists, so they were looking at paintings from, say, Monet, then Picasso, then back to Monet, were much better at identifying new paintings by those artists than students who studied each artist in blocks.
So instead of doing all the Monet, then all the Picassos,
Right, and they mixed them up.
mixing them up led to better learning.
Exactly. And this has been replicated in lots of other areas too, like learning to identify different species of birds, different types of math problems, different musical styles, even different patterns in medical images.
Wow. So it really seems to be a general principle.
It does, and it's particularly powerful, it seems, when the things you're trying to learn are quite similar to each other.
Because that's when discrimination becomes more challenging.
Exactly.
Now, the research also mentions something called the association hypothesis, which is kind of building on this idea of discrimination. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So the association hypothesis, put forward by Rohrer and colleagues, suggests that interleaving not only helps you to discriminate between different types of problems, but it also helps you to associate those problem types with the correct solution methods.
Okay, so you're not just recognizing the problem, you're also remembering how to solve it.
Exactly. And the thinking is that when you practice a block of similar problems, you might just keep applying the same technique without really thinking about why it's the right approach for that particular problem.
You're almost on autopilot.
Right. But when you're constantly switching between different types of problems, you have to be more mindful. You have to actively select the appropriate strategy for each one.
So it's forcing you to think more deeply about the underlying concepts. Okay, so we've got these two very distinct explanations. Working memory recovery for spaced practice, and this enhanced discrimination and association for interleaved practice. Now, what I found really compelling in the research was the evidence showing that these effects don't always happen. And specifically, they don't happen when the conditions for each mechanism aren't met. Can you walk us through some of those null effect studies? Because I think those are really illuminating.
Yeah, absolutely. The null effect studies are really important because they show us that it's not just about spacing or interleaving in any old way. The specific conditions matter.
Right, it's not magic.
Exactly. So on the spaced practice side, there were studies where learning was spread out because different topics are being interleaved. But because there was no actual mental rest, no true break from deliberate learning, the typical benefits of spaced practice weren't seen.
Interesting. So just switching between topics isn't enough.
Right. It seems that the brain needs that true rest period to consolidate information and recover those working memory resources.
Okay, so what about on the interleaving side? Were there studies where they mixed up the learning but didn't see the expected benefits in discrimination?
Yeah, there were. And these typically involved learning materials that were already very easy to tell apart. So if you don't need to actively discriminate between things, then the mechanism behind interleave practice isn't really engaged.
So if the differences are already really obvious, interleaving doesn't add much value.
Right. It's like if you were trying to learn the difference between an apple and an orange, interleaving probably wouldn't help much because they're already so visually distinct.
Right, okay, that makes sense. So it really seems to be about matching the strategy to the specific learning challenge.
Exactly. And those null effects studies really highlight that.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. Practical implications. When should we use spaced practice, and when might interleaved practice be the better strategy?
So based on what we've discussed, here's a simple rule of thumb. Use spaced practice when you need to give your brain a break from actively learning a particular topic. When you're feeling mentally tired or overloaded, Stepping away and returning later with a true rest in between is likely to be more effective.
Okay, so space it out when you need a mental break.
Right. On the other hand, use interleaved practice when your goal is to become better at distinguishing between similar concepts or skills. If you find yourself mixing things up, if you're struggling to see the subtle differences, then interleaving your practice can help you sharpen that ability to discriminate.
Got it. So, for example, if I'm trying to learn a bunch of new vocabulary words in a foreign language, I might use spaced practice and take breaks between study sessions. But if I'm trying to learn different grammar rules that I keep getting confused, then I might use interleaving and miss up those different grammar exercises.
Exactly. And of course, in the real world, you'll often encounter situations where a combination of both approaches might be optimal. You might space out your overall study sessions, but then within each session, you might interleave practice on different skills.
It's about being flexible and strategic.
Right. The key takeaway is that understanding these mechanisms allows you to be more intentional about how you structure your learning.
I love that. So, just to recap, spaced practice and interleaved practice, both incredibly powerful learning strategies, but they work in different ways. Spaced practice seems to primarily benefit learning by allowing our working memory to recover, while interleaved practice helps us to better discriminate between similar things.
That's a great summary. And as you go about your own learning, I encourage you to think about these principles. Think about times in the past when you might have intuitively used one of these strategies and how it worked for you, or maybe times when you relied on cramming, and now, knowing what you see how spaced practice might have been a better approach.
Right. It's about becoming more aware of how our brains learn best. So here's a final thought to leave everyone with. Now that you have a deeper understanding of these mechanisms, how might you strategically design your learning experiences, or even the learning experiences of others, to truly maximize how well information is learned and retained over the long term?
It's a really powerful question because it's not just about putting in more hours, it's about using those hours in the most effective way possible.
Absolutely. And with these tools, we can all become more efficient and effective learners.
I completely agree.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.